Mike Tyson had spent the better part of the afternoon in his garage in Brooklyn, organizing his tools and securing his equipment before winter set in. It was a typical Saturday for him, taking care of his property just like any responsible homeowner. The late afternoon sun dipped behind the towering buildings, casting long shadows across his driveway. As he wiped his hands on a rag and hit the garage door button, a familiar sense of satisfaction settled over him. But just as the heavy metal door began to descend, movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. He turned slightly and saw her, Karen Whitmore, his next-door neighbor, standing on her porch, arms crossed, eyes locked onto him with an unsettling intensity. At first, Mike brushed it off. Curious neighbors were nothing new, but something about Karen's demeanor sent a prickle of unease up his spine. Then, without warning, she stepped off the porch and marched toward him, her steps sharp and deliberate. Her face was twisted with suspicion, and before he could say a word, she blurted out, "Who are you?" "What are you doing here?" Her voice was laced with hostility, like she had already decided he didn't belong. Mike, a man who had faced the toughest fighters in the ring, was no stranger to confrontation. But this was different. This wasn't a fight he had signed up for. Yet the tension in the air was thick, electric, and charged with something far more dangerous than a punch to the jaw. Mike Tyson narrowed his eyes, his jaw tightening as he studied Karen's face. Her tone wasn't just suspicious. It was accusatory, laced with a bitterness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He had seen this before. He knew exactly where this was going. "I live here, Karen," he said evenly, keeping his voice calm. "You've seen me 100 times. You know that." Karen scoffed, her lips twisting into a smirk. "No, I know who really lives here. And it's not you." Before Mike could respond, she yanked out her phone and, without hesitation, began dialing. "911, what's your emergency?" "There's a suspicious man in my neighborhood." Karen practically spat into the receiver, her voice dripping with urgency. "Right in front of my house. He's acting strange, lurking around, and I don't feel safe." Mike felt a rush of frustration boil up inside him, but he held his ground. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. He had lived here for years, and yet Karen was treating him like a stranger, no worse, like a threat. The dispatcher on the other end hesitated. Maybe they sensed the holes in her story, the way she was too quick, too eager to escalate things. But still, the damage was done. "We'll send officers to investigate," the dispatcher finally said. Karen ended the call with a satisfied huff, tucking the phone back into her pocket. She didn't even look at Mike before turning and striding back to her house, slamming the door behind her. Mike took a slow, deep breath, trying to steady his pulse. He had fought battles in the ring, faced off against legends. But this wasn't a fight he could end with his fists. This was a different kind of opponent, one far more insidious. Minutes passed and then sirens. A squad car turned the corner, its tires whining against the pavement as it pulled up to his driveway. The moment was surreal. Mike had done nothing wrong. He had simply been closing his garage like any other homeowner. But Karen had already set the stage, and now he had to play the part she had written for him. The first officer, a tall man with a stern face, stepped out of the car, eyes scanning the scene, before settling on Mike. "Sir," the officer began, voice neutral but probing, "we got a call about suspicious activity. Can you tell us what's going on?" Mike met the officer's gaze, his stance unwavering. "I live here," he said firmly, gesturing to his house. "I was just closing my garage when my neighbor called you. I don't know what she told you, but I've done nothing wrong." The officer studied him for a moment, then turned toward Karen's house. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching with thinly veiled satisfaction. The second officer, a woman, frowned slightly before asking, "Do you have ID or proof of ownership?" Without hesitation, Mike reached into his pocket, pulling out his driver's license and a copy of his property records. He handed them over, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Years of experience had taught him that even the slightest wrong move could turn a situation like this into something far worse. The officers examined the documents, their initial skepticism fading as they confirmed his address. A crackle of radio static later, the confirmation came through. Mike Tyson did own this house. The male officer let out a slow breath, glancing toward Karen's house. He wasn't stupid. He had seen cases like this before. It looks like everything checks out, he finally said, handing Mike back his ID. But then he turned toward Karen, his expression hardening. Ma'am, he called out, his voice edged with authority. You need to stop wasting emergency resources. This is not a real emergency. Karen's face flushed red, but she said nothing. Mike watched as the officers turned back toward their squad car. The male officer gave him a nod, almost an apology. Have a good day, sir. The car pulled away, leaving Karen standing in her doorway, still fuming. Mike exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the garage remote. He had won this round, but something told him this wasn't over. And he was right. Because the next time Karen called the cops, things would escalate far beyond anything he had imagined. What do you think happens next? Will Karen stop? Or will she take her false accusations even further? Drop a fire emoji in the comments. If you want to see part 3, if you're on Mike's side, comment number Justice for Mike. And don't forget, like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The squad car disappeared around the corner, but the tension in the air lingered like a storm that hadn't fully passed. Mike stood motionless in his driveway, his grip tightening around the garage remote. His pulse had slowed, but the frustration still burned in his chest. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was something far worse. He turned his gaze back toward Karen's house. She was still standing on her porch, arms crossed, her lips pursed in an expression that teetered between triumph and anger. Even with the officers dismissing her call, she didn't look defeated. No, she looked determined. Mike knew that look. He had seen it in the ring. Fighters who couldn't accept a loss, who came back swinging harder, more desperate. But this wasn't a sanctioned fight. This was something much uglier. He exhaled sharply and turned toward his front door, trying to push the encounter out of his mind. He'd done everything right, kept his composure, proved his innocence. But as he stepped inside, locking the door behind him, a nagging feeling crept into his gut. This wasn't over. Later that night, as he sat at his kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him, he found himself searching for something, anything, to make sense of Karen's hostility. Was she always like this? Had she done this to others before? It didn't take long to find answers. Karen Whitmore's name appeared in local news articles, most of them minor neighborhood disputes, complaints about loud music, arguments with delivery drivers, petty disagreements over property lines. But the deeper he dug, the more unsettling the picture became. Buried within public records and online forums, Mike found reports of something worse. Karen had a history of filing false police reports, targeting certain individuals, people who, like Mike, she seemed to believe didn't belong. There were whispers of restraining orders, accusations of harassment, even an old court case where a former neighbor had sued her for defamation. That case had been quietly settled, the details buried, but the implications were clear. Karen didn't just call the police on a whim. She weaponized them. Mike leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. His instincts had been right. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was calculated. And then he found something that made his stomach turn. A decades-old police report listed Karen's name in connection with a criminal investigation, one involving fraud, theft, and organized intimidation tactics. She hadn't been convicted, but the evidence had been damning enough to suggest she wasn't just an aggressive neighbor. She had connections. Mike's fists clenched as he stared at the screen. This wasn't just about one bad encounter. Karen had a pattern, a history, and now she had set her sights on him. He closed the laptop and took a deep breath. He wasn't afraid of a fight. He never had been. But this wasn't about fists or strength. This was about something more dangerous. And if Karen thought she could push him out of his own home, she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Mike sat in the dim glow of his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as he pieced together the disturbing puzzle that was Karen Whitmore. The more he uncovered, the deeper the pit in his stomach grew. This wasn't just a case of an overzealous neighbor with a superiority complex. Karen had a past, riddled with deception, intimidation, and outright criminal activity. He scrolled through an old article buried in a local news archive, detailing a series of petty thefts from nearly 2 decades ago. The suspect? A woman named Karen Whitmore. The charges had mysteriously disappeared before trial, but the pattern didn't end there. Another police report showed allegations of fraud. Karen had once been involved in an identity theft scheme, funneling money through fake accounts before vanishing just as investigators closed in. Again, the case had been quietly dropped. It was as if she always managed to slip through the cracks. Mike's jaw clenched as he kept reading. There were rumors of something even worse, connections to an organized group involved in intimidation tactics. Witnesses had accused Karen of orchestrating threats, bullying people out of their homes, and even using law enforcement as a weapon against those she deemed unworthy of living near her. And then he found the final damning piece, a grainy image from a newspaper article. It showed Karen at a rally, one that had turned violent. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was leading it. Mike sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't about him personally. Karen didn't just hate him. She hated people like him. Her hostility wasn't random. It was rooted in something far uglier, something she had nurtured for years. She had made a habit of singling people out, pushing them to their limits, using fear and manipulation to control them. But what she didn't realize was that Mike wasn't the type to be bullied. He pulled up another window and started gathering everything: screenshots, records, police reports. If Karen thought she could intimidate him, she was dead wrong. As he worked, his phone buzzed on the table. A message from an unknown number. Stop digging. Mike stared at the screen, his heartbeat steady, but his grip on the phone tightening. This was bigger than just Karen. And now, he was in the middle of it. The next morning, Mike Tyson stepped outside, the crisp autumn air biting at his skin as he pulled his trash cans toward the curb. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sounds coming from distant traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. For a moment, everything felt normal, but he knew better. His gut told him to stay alert, and sure enough, movement from across the street caught his eye. Karen. She stood on her porch, eyes locked onto him like a predator sizing up its prey. But today, something was different. Her expression wasn't just suspicious. It was angry, calculated. Mike barely had time to react before she stormed down her steps, her fists clenched at her sides. "You've been watching me," she accused, her voice shaking with faux outrage. "You got way too close to my property yesterday, and now I feel unsafe." Mike let out a sharp breath, keeping his stance relaxed, but his patience was wearing thin. "Karen, I haven't done a damn thing to you," he said evenly. "I'm taking my trash out. That's it." But she wasn't interested in reason. She was looking for a fight, one she thought she could win. Her hand shot into her pocket, and before Mike could stop her, she was already dialing 911. "What's your emergency?" "There's a black man harassing me," Karen practically screamed into the phone, her voice dripping with false panic. "He's on my property. I don't feel safe. He's been watching me, following me. I think he's dangerous." Mike's hands curled into fists at his sides. He knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just lying. She was trying to turn the system against him. A cold, familiar anger simmered in his chest, but he forced himself to stay still. He had seen too many situations like this spiral out of control. He couldn't give her that satisfaction. The dispatcher on the other end of the line hesitated. Even from where he stood, Mike could hear the skepticism in their voice. "Ma'am, is the person currently threatening you?" "Yes," Karen insisted. "He's right in front of me. He won't leave." Mike exhaled slowly, his heartbeat steady. He wasn't going anywhere. If Karen wanted another scene, she was going to get one, but this time, he was ready. Minutes later, the wail of approaching sirens filled the air. 2 squad cars pulled up, lights flashing, doors swinging open as uniformed officers stepped out. One of them, the same officer from yesterday, immediately frowned when he saw Mike. Karen rushed toward them before they could even assess the situation, her voice trembling with exaggerated fear. "He was threatening me," she cried. "He's been watching my house, waiting for me to come outside." The officer sighed, exchanging a look with his partner. Something about Karen's story wasn't adding up, and this time, Mike wasn't the one under suspicion. The air in the neighborhood felt thick with tension as the officers approached. Karen stood at the center of the chaos she had created, pointing an accusatory finger at Mike, her voice sharp with false distress. "He's been harassing me for days. I've seen him lurking near my house, staring at me. He won't leave me alone," she exclaimed, her face contorted with feigned fear. Mike stood his ground, his expression calm, but his patience wearing thin. He knew exactly what she was trying to do. She wanted the officers to see a dangerous man, not a homeowner taking out his trash. But today, things weren't going to play out the way she expected. The lead officer, the same one from the previous encounter, folded his arms and glanced at his partner before addressing Karen. "Ma'am, you called us yesterday with a similar claim," he said, his voice laced with skepticism. "We verified that Mr. Tyson lives here. What exactly is the emergency this time?" Karen blinked, momentarily thrown off by the officer's doubt. But she recovered quickly. He was watching me. He was getting too close to my property." "I don't feel safe," she snapped, her voice rising. The female officer standing beside her sighed and turned toward Mike. "Sir, can you explain what happened?" Mike exhaled slowly, keeping his voice level. "I was putting my trash cans by the curb. That's it. Karen came outside and started yelling at me, accusing me of things I haven't done. Then she called you." The lead officer nodded, his suspicion growing. "Do you have any security cameras, Mr. Tyson?" A small smirk played at the corner of Mike's lips. "Yeah, I do." Karen's face paled slightly. Without missing a beat, Mike pulled out his phone and tapped a few buttons, bringing up a live feed from his home security cameras. He turned the screen toward the officers, letting them watch as the footage played. There it was, crystal clear evidence. The video showed Mike calmly moving his trash cans, while Karen stormed across her yard, shouting at him, before she even picked up her phone to call 911. The officers exchanged glances, their decision made in an instant. The lead officer turned back to Karen, his jaw tightening. "Ma'am, this is the second time you falsely reported this man for a crime he didn't commit. Do you understand that filing a false police report is a criminal offense?" Karen's eyes widened. "Wait, I was just trying to be cautious. You don't understand, "Ma'am, I do understand," the officer cut her off, his voice firm. "And what I see here is harassment." Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Mike watched as the officer pulled out a notepad, taking down notes, while his partner spoke into her radio. He had spent his entire life fighting battles in the ring, but this was different. This was a fight he had never wanted, but one he refused to lose. And this was just the beginning. What do you think happens next? Will Karen finally face justice, or will she find another way to manipulate the situation? Comment number Justice for Mike if you want the truth to win. And don't forget, like, share, and subscribe to see what happens next. Karen's face twisted in shock as the officer's words sank in. For the first time, she was no longer in control of the situation. The usual arrogance that dripped from her every word had drained away, replaced with something else. Panic. I was just being cautious," she stammered, her voice cracking. "You don't understand. We understand perfectly, ma'am." The officer cut her off, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You made 2 false police reports in 2 days, both against a man who has done absolutely nothing wrong." Karen's lips parted as if she wanted to protest, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of the officer's scrutiny pressed down on her. For once, she was the one being judged. Mike stood still, watching everything unfold. His heart was steady, his hands relaxed at his sides, but inside, he could feel the slow burn of satisfaction. For years, people like Karen had weaponized fear, twisting the system to serve their own prejudices. But not this time. The female officer spoke into her radio, requesting a supervisor on site. Meanwhile, the lead officer turned his full attention back to Karen. "Ma'am, we're going to have to ask you some more questions. Step over here," he ordered, gesturing toward the sidewalk. Karen's eyes darted around, looking for a way out, but there was none. Then, as if sensing the walls closing in, her mask cracked. Her frustration boiled over. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "He's the one harassing me. You're just believing him because the officer's gaze hardened. Because we have proof, ma'am." Karen's face flushed deep red, her hands shaking. Her breathing turned ragged, and for a second, Mike thought she might lash out. But instead, she did something worse. She let her true self slip through the cracks. "You're all a bunch of idiots," she spat, her voice venomous. "He doesn't belong in this neighborhood. I know what people like him are capable of. You're making a huge mistake protecting him over me." Silence. The words hung in the air, raw and undeniable. The officers' faces remained neutral, but the shift in their body language was unmistakable. This wasn't just an angry neighbor anymore. This was something deeper, something uglier. And she had just exposed herself in the worst way possible. The lead officer inhaled slowly, choosing his next words carefully. "Ma'am," he said, his voice measured, "you're under arrest for filing false police reports, harassment, and disorderly conduct." Karen's eyes widened. No, you can't." The female officer stepped forward, pulling out her cuffs. "Put your hands behind your back." Karen recoiled as if she had been struck. "You can't do this. I'm the victim." But there was no escape now. As the cuffs clicked shut around her wrists, Mike finally let himself breathe. It was over. Or at least, this part was. As the squad car's doors slammed shut behind Karen, a strange silence settled over the neighborhood. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the houses, illuminating the stunned faces of neighbors who had stepped outside to watch the spectacle unfold. Mike Tyson stood motionless, his eyes locked on the vehicle as it idled in the street. Karen was still shouting from inside, her muffled protests barely audible over the engine's low rumble. But it didn't matter anymore. Her reign of intimidation was finally over. The lead officer approached him, his expression softer now. "I'm sorry you had to deal with this, Mr. Tyson," he said. "We're going to process her and investigate further. Given the evidence, I'd recommend filing a restraining order." Mike gave a slow nod. "Appreciate it, officer." He didn't need a fight, he never had. But he had refused to back down, refused to let Karen's lies dictate his life. And now, for the first time since this nightmare began, he felt the weight on his chest start to lift. As the squad car pulled away, the neighborhood seemed to exhale with relief. Conversations sparked among the bystanders. Murmurs of disbelief mixed with cautious approval. "I always knew something was off about her," one woman muttered. "She called the cops on my nephew last year for walking his dog too close to her yard," another man added. "We should have spoken up sooner." Mike turned toward them, his expression unreadable. He wasn't angry at them, not exactly. But their words confirmed what he had already suspected. Karen's behavior hadn't been an isolated incident. She had spent years using fear to control the people around her, counting on their silence to protect her. But silence hadn't saved her this time. As Mike walked back toward his house, the evening air felt different, lighter. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to relax. But just as he reached his front steps, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, frowning at the unknown number flashing across the screen. He hesitated, then answered. A distorted voice crackled through the receiver. "You should have left it alone." Mike's grip on the phone tightened. The line went dead. A slow, creeping sensation settled in his chest. This wasn't over. Not yet. Karen might have been exposed, but she wasn't the only one with something to hide. As we step into 2025, Mike Tyson's ordeal serves as a stark reminder that prejudice and abuse of power still exist, even in communities that claim to be progressive. Karen's actions weren't just about personal bias. They reflected a system that, for too long, has allowed people like her to weaponize authority against those they see as outsiders. But this time, the system didn't work in her favor. Thanks to Mike's composure, his willingness to stand his ground, and the growing awareness of false accusations, justice prevailed. The lesson here is clear. Silence enables injustice. Had Mike not gathered evidence, had the officers not questioned Karen's claims, the outcome could have been much different. In 2025, technology and social awareness give us more tools than ever to fight back against discrimination. Security cameras, digital records, and community support can expose the truth faster than ever before. but vigilance is still required. How many others like Karen are still out there manipulating the system, escaping consequences? Mike may have won this battle, but his fight isn't over. That anonymous phone call was a warning. Someone else is watching. Who and why? Should Mike dig deeper, or should he walk away while he still can? Let's show our support for Mike. Comment number justice. For Mike, if you stand with him, what do you think his next move should be? Should he go to the authorities with what he's found, or is he stepping into something far more dangerous? Drop your thoughts below, because this story isn't over yet.